You see this postcard perfect, awe-inspiring marvel of engineering stretching across the French countryside like some ancient stone rainbow. The Pont du Gard, three tiers of pristine limestone arches carrying crystal clear mountain water to thirsty Roman cities. The history books tell you it's a testament to Roman genius. Roman power, Roman vision, they're not wrong exactly, but they left out the most important part. They left out the endless mind-numbing meetings where senators argued about bathroom budgets, the cost overruns that would make a Pentagon contractor blush, the shady contractors who cut corners with watered-down concrete, the interdepartmental rivalries that nearly brought the whole project crashing down, the workplace accidents that would give OSHA agents nightmares, and that one guy who actually knew what he was doing, desperately trying to manage a legion of incompetent middle managers who thought hydraulic engineering was some kind of fancy Greek sandwich. This isn't just the story of Rome's greatest feat. It's the story of the ancient world's most chaotic, underfunded, and frankly hilarious project management disaster. It's ancient history meets the office with more death traps and significantly worse coffee. Alright folks, what is up? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to what might be our longest, most wonderfully tedious deep dive yet. Seriously, settle in. Grab your drink of choice water tea, hot chocolate, or maybe some heavily diluted wine if you want to get historically authentic. Just remember the Romans watered down their wine for a reason, and it wasn't just to prevent hangovers. Tonight we're not talking about Caesar crossing the Rubicon in a moment of world-changing drama. We're not discussing gladiators fighting to the death in the blood-soaked sands of the Colosseum. No epic battles, no palace intrigue, no assassinations on the Ides of March. No, no, no. We're going way deeper than that. Way more real, way more relatable. We're diving into the nitty-gritty, bureaucratic, soul-crushingly mundane truth behind how the Romans managed to give a city of 1 million people running water. Clean water, reliable water. Water that flowed uphill around mountains, through valleys, and into fountains that never stopped flowing for over 4 centuries. Forget the marble busts of stoic emperors gazing nobly into the distance. Think of them as distant, out-of-touch CEOs who occasionally wandered down from the executive suite. We're going to meet the Dwight Schrutes of Roman surveying, obsessively measuring gradients with homemade instruments. The Michael Scotts of provincial project management, convinced their terrible ideas are strokes of genius. The Jim Halperts quietly documenting the absurdity around them in graffiti carved into tunnel walls. And oh, so many Tobys who got blamed every single time an aqueduct sprung a leak, a budget went over, or a tunnel collapsed on someone important. This is the story they definitely didn't teach you in school because honestly, it's way too human, too messy, too much like every frustrating workplace you've ever been part of, except with more lead poisoning and a significantly higher chance of being eaten by wild animals. So, if you dig this kind of deep dive into the messy, chaotic, beautifully human side of history, do me a solid and hit that subscribe button. And maybe the bell icon too, but only if you promise not to jump out of your skin when you get a notification at 2 a.m. It just tells the great algorithm overlords that you're into the real story, not just the highlight reel. The behind-the-scenes disaster footage, not the polished museum display. No pressure though, I mean a little pressure, but like gentle pressure. The kind of pressure that builds up slowly in a Roman aqueduct system, until it either works perfectly or explodes spectacularly. There's really no middle ground. Alright, seriously now, this is your official permission to get comfortable. Dim those lights if you want. Find your comfy spot on the couch, or just let this play in the background while you do whatever it is you do to unwind. Fold laundry, organize your sock drawer, contemplate the meaninglessness of existence. Whatever floats your boat, we're going on a long, slow, delightfully meandering journey through 2.5 hours of historical chaos. No jump scares, I promise. No sudden loud explosions or dramatic music stings. Just a steady, calming stream of ancient bureaucratic disasters and engineering nightmares narrated in the most soothing way possible. Think of my voice as the gentle flow of water in the aqueduct itself, carrying you peacefully downstream towards sleep, just with significantly more sarcasm and fewer opportunities for lead poisoning. So to understand our story, we need to understand the problem. Every great, terrible, soul-crushing project starts with a need, a demand from the client, a requirement that seems simple until you actually try to do it. And in this case, the client was the city of Rome itself. Not just any city, mind you, but the sprawling, magnificent, incredibly thirsty beast. That was the capital of the known world. Picture it. You're standing in the heart of the ancient world, the center of an empire that stretches from Britain to Syria, from the Rhine to the Sahara. The most powerful, most advanced, most sophisticated city humanity has ever built. And the first thing you notice, the very first thing that hits you as you walk through those gates, isn't the marble temples or the golden statues or the impressive forms, it's the smell. The overwhelming, inescapable, nostril-burning smell of a million people living in close quarters with a water system that can charitably be described as inadequate, and more honestly described as a public health disaster waiting to happen. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the beginning with the greatest client brief from hell in human history. Let's talk about what happens when the most powerful empire on earth realizes it has a plumbing problem. Let me paint you a picture of Rome in the 4th century BCE, before the great aqueducts transformed it into the marble and fountain paradise we imagine today. You're walking through the Subura, the densely packed working-class district where most Romans actually lived. The streets are narrow, barely wide enough for two people to pass without bumping shoulders. The buildings tower above you, 6, 7, sometimes 8 stories of rickety wooden apartments called insula that creak and sway in the wind. And everywhere there's water, or rather, there's the desperate, constant, overwhelming need for water. You can hear it in the voices of the water carriers, the aquarii who trudge up and down those narrow staircases dozens of times a day, hauling clay jars and leather bags, filled with whatever they could scoop from the nearest source. Their backs are bent, their faces are weathered, and they charge premium prices for liquid that you wouldn't use to wash your dog. Because here's the thing about early Rome that the history books gloss over: it was built in a swamp. The Tiber River meanders through the city like a sluggish brown snake, carrying not just water but the sewage, the industrial waste, the dead animals, and the general detritus of a million people who haven't quite figured out the concept of downstream consequences. The Romans called it their lifeline, their highway, their blessing from the gods. What they didn't call it, at least not in polite company, was drinkable. Imagine opening your tap and getting something that looks like chocolate milk but smells like a truck stop bathroom on the 3rd day of a music festival. That was the Tiber on a good day. On a bad day during the summer months when the water level dropped and the temperature soared, it was more like opening your tap and getting chunky soup. Chunky soup that occasionally contained things that used to be alive. But hey, water is water, right? The Romans made do. They had to. They boiled it when they could afford the fuel. They strained it through cloth when they remembered. They mixed it with wine when they could afford wine, which had the double benefit of making it slightly more palatable and slightly more antiseptic. And when all else failed, they held their breath and hoped for the best. Now you might be thinking, surely they had wells. Oh, they had wells, lots of wells, wells dug deep into the 7 hills of Rome, tapping into underground springs, and aquifers that had sustained smaller settlements for centuries. But here's the problem with wells in a city of 1 million people math. Let's do some ancient arithmetic. An average Roman needed about 5 gallons of water per day for drinking, cooking, and basic hygiene. Multiply that by 1 million people, and you're looking at 5 million gallons per day, every day, without fail. Rain or shine, summer or winter plague, or plenty. Now, how much water can you reasonably expect to pull from wells in a hilly Mediterranean climate? Not 5 million gallons, I can tell you that much. The wells that had sustained a population of 50,000 were completely overwhelmed by a population of 1 million. Water tables dropped. Wells went dry. The lucky neighborhoods that still had functioning wells charged outrageous prices. The unlucky neighborhoods made do with whatever they could find. And then there were the public fountains fed by natural springs and carefully maintained by city officials who took their jobs seriously because the alternative was being torn apart by thirsty mobs. These fountains were the social centers of Roman neighborhoods, the ancient equivalent of office water coolers, where people gathered to gossip, argue politics, and wait in line for their daily allocation of marginally clean water. But even the best public fountains couldn't keep up with demand. Picture the longest line you've ever waited in at the DMV, then multiply that by 10 and add the constant fear that the water might run out before you reach the front. That was daily life for most Romans, standing in line, clay jar in hand, hoping that today wouldn't be the day. The spring finally gave up entirely. The wealthy, of course, had options. They could afford to have water delivered directly to their homes, carried by teams of aquarii who charged premium prices for the convenience. They could afford to have private wells dug in their courtyards, hiring skilled workers to dig deeper and deeper until they hit reliable water sources. They could afford to boil their water filter, it stored in clean containers, and generally treat it like the precious resource it was. But even the wealthy had limits. Even a rich Roman senator couldn't afford to fill a swimming pool, couldn't afford to water extensive gardens, couldn't afford to run the kind of elaborate fountains and water features that would become symbols of Roman luxury in later centuries. The physics just didn't work. There simply wasn't enough water to go around. And then there's the issue that nobody likes to talk about, but that dominated daily life in ancient Rome: sanitation. See, water isn't just for drinking, it's for washing, it's for cooking, it's for disposing of waste in a way that doesn't turn your city into a giant petri dish of disease and death. The Romans, to their credit, understood this better than most ancient civilizations. They built public latrines, elaborate multi-seat affairs where citizens could gather to take care of business while discussing the latest gladiator matches or political scandals. They built public baths, magnificent complexes where people could wash, exercise, socialize, and generally maintain some semblance of personal hygiene. But all of these facilities required water. Lots of water. Constantly flowing, constantly refreshing water that could wash away waste and keep disease at bay. And in early Rome, that water had to come from somewhere. Usually it came from the same sources that provided drinking water, which created a vicious cycle of contamination and shortage that would make a modern epidemiologist weep. The public baths, which would later become one of the defining features of Roman civilization, were in the 4th century BCE mostly just expensive fantasies. A few small facilities existed for the wealthy, fed by whatever clean water could be diverted from drinking supplies. But the grand thermae, the vast public bath complexes that could accommodate thousands of bathers, were impossible. The water simply wasn't there. So most Romans made do with what we might generously call splash baths, quick washings with whatever water they could spare from cooking and drinking. Personal hygiene was a luxury that most people couldn't afford, which contributed to the general aromatic landscape of the city. Rome may have been the center of the civilized world, but it smelled like a medieval city during a garbage strike. The situation was unsustainable and everyone knew it. City officials spent their days managing water shortages, rationing supplies, and trying to prevent riots when wells ran dry. Engineers and architects were constantly proposing new solutions: deeper wells, better filtration systems, more efficient distribution networks. But every solution ran up against the same fundamental problem. There simply wasn't enough accessible water in the immediate vicinity of Rome to support a city of its size. The Romans were facing what modern urban planners would recognize as a classic resource crisis. They had grown beyond the carrying capacity of their local environment, and they had 3 options: limit growth, move the city, or find a way to import resources from outside the local area. Limiting growth was politically impossible. Rome's expansion was driven by military conquest, trade, and the constant influx of people from across the Mediterranean. You can't just put up a sign saying, "Sorry, we're full," when you're running an empire. Moving the city was logistically impossible. Rome wasn't just a city. It was the administrative, religious, and cultural heart of the known world. The very idea of relocating the capital was unthinkable. That left option 3, find a way to import water from outside the local area. Find springs in the mountains, rivers in distant valleys, sources of clean, abundant water that could somehow be transported across dozens of miles of hostile terrain and delivered to the city in sufficient quantities to meet the needs of 1 million people. It was an insane idea. It was an impossible idea. It was an idea that would require engineering techniques that hadn't been invented yet, construction projects on a scale that had never been attempted, and expenditures that would bankrupt most kingdoms. In other words, it was exactly the kind of challenge that the Romans couldn't resist. They were, after all, the people who would later build straight roads through mountain ranges, construct harbors where no natural harbors existed, and generally treat the phrase, "it can't be done," as a personal insult. But before we get to the engineering marvels and the construction disasters, we need to understand the moment when someone somewhere in the halls of Roman power first stood up in a meeting and said the words that would change everything. So we're going to build a river. Picture this. It's 312 BCE, and you're sitting in what might be the most consequential business meeting in human history. The location is somewhere in the heart of Rome, possibly the Curia, possibly a private villa, possibly just a room where important men gather to make decisions that will affect millions of lives. The air is thick with the smoke of oil lamps and the tension of men who know they're about to discuss spending an absolutely ridiculous amount of money on something that has never been done before. At the head of the table sits Appius Claudius Caecus, censor of Rome, a man whose name will be remembered for 2,000 years, though probably not for the reasons he expects. He's what we might charitably call a visionary, and what his political enemies less charitably call that maniac who thinks he can move mountains. Today he's about to propose something so audacious, so technically challenging, and so expensive that it will make the most ambitious modern infrastructure projects look like weekend DIY endeavors. Appius clears his throat and begins what might be the greatest PowerPoint presentation in history, except there's no PowerPoint, no slides, just a man with a crazy idea and the political clout to make it happen. "Gentlemen," he says, and you can imagine the way he draws out the words, savoring the moment, "I have a solution to our water problem." Around the table, senators and officials lean forward, some with genuine interest, others with the weary resignation of people who have heard too many solutions that involved throwing good money after bad. One of them, let's call him Gaius Cottius, is already mentally calculating how much this is going to cost and how much of it is going to come out of his family's tax contributions. We're going to build a river," Appius continues, and the room goes dead silent. Not the comfortable silence of people processing information, but the awkward silence of people wondering if they heard correctly. "I'm sorry," says Marcus Skepticus, a senator known for his practical mindset and his ability to kill bad ideas with surgical precision. "Did you just say we're going to build a river?" "Not just any river," Appius replies, warming to his theme. "We're going to find the cleanest, most abundant springs in the Alban Hills springs that have been flowing pure sweet water since the gods first shaped the earth. Then we're going to build a man-made channel, a stone river if you will, that carries that water all the way to Rome. 11 miles of the most sophisticated hydraulic engineering the world has ever seen. You can practically hear the gears grinding in the heads of everyone present. Some are trying to visualize the engineering challenges. Others are trying to calculate the cost. Still others are wondering if Appius has been sampling too much of that unwatered wine. Let me make sure I understand this correctly," says Lucius Practical, the kind of man who asks uncomfortable questions about budgets and timelines. "You want to build an artificial river 11 miles long that carries water from springs in the hills to the city of Rome. An artificial river that has to maintain a consistent flow day and night, year-round for decades or centuries." "Exactly," says Appius, apparently missing the note of incredulity in Lucius's voice. "And this artificial river," continues Marcus Skepticus, "it has to cross valleys, navigate around hills, possibly go through hills, and somehow deliver water to a city that sits on 7 hills of its own." "Precisely," Appius nods, still enthusiastic. "Water," adds Gaius Cottius slowly, "flows downhill." "Yes," agrees Appius, "which is why we'll need to maintain a consistent gradient across the entire 11-mile length. A slope gentle enough to prevent erosion, steep enough to maintain flow, and precise enough to ensure the water actually reaches its destination instead of pooling somewhere in the countryside. The silence that follows this statement is the kind of silence that occurs when a group of intelligent people simultaneously realize they're dealing with either a genius or a complete lunatic, and they're not sure which. Has anyone, asks Lucius practical, ever built anything like this before? No, admits Appius cheerfully. We'll be making it up as we go along. And the cost? Asks Gaius Claudius, because someone has to ask about the cost. Well, says Appius, and you can imagine him doing some quick mental arithmetic that probably bears no resemblance to reality. I estimate it shouldn't cost more than a moderately successful military campaign. Which moderately successful military campaign, presses Gaius? Oh, you know, a standard conquest of a medium-sized city. Maybe the equivalent of sacking Syracuse, but without all the valuable loot to offset expenses. Around the table, you can see the mental calculations happening. The conquest of Syracuse had cost the equivalent of several years' worth of tax revenue from multiple provinces, and that was for a project with a clear military objective and a reasonable expectation of profit through plunder. This was for a project that would produce nothing more tangible than the ability to turn a tap and get clean water. And who exactly, asks Marcus Skepticus, is going to design and build this unprecedented feat of engineering? Well, says Appius, we have some very talented military engineers who have built bridges and siege works. Have any of them built an 11-mile artificial river? No, but how hard can it be? The phrase, how hard can it be, has probably launched more disasters than any other combination of words in human history. It's the phrase that launched the Titanic, the Hindenburg, and every home renovation project that has ever gone catastrophically over budget. In this case, it's about to launch the most ambitious construction project in human history. Let me understand the logistics, says Lucius Practical, because someone needs to be the adult in the room. We need to survey 11 miles of terrain with precision that has never been achieved before. We need to excavate and construct channels through whatever terrain we encounter. We need to build bridges, possibly tunnels, certainly some kind of distribution system in the city itself. We need to acquire the land, manage the construction crews, source the materials, and somehow coordinate all of this without any of the communication or project management tools that we might need for something this complex. That's about the size of it, agrees Appius. And we're going to do all of this, continues Lucius, while maintaining the regular functions of government managing our existing territories and hopefully not getting invaded by anyone who might see a massive construction project as a sign of distraction or weakness. Right, with a budget based on your rough estimate of what a military campaign might cost, more or less, using engineering techniques that we're going to invent as we go along. Essentially, yes. At this point, you can imagine one of the younger senators, maybe someone who hasn't yet learned that pointing out obvious problems is a career-limiting move, raising his hand tentatively. Excuse me, but has anyone considered just praying for more rain? The look that Appius gives him could freeze the Tiber in midsummer. Praying for more rain, he says slowly, is not a comprehensive water management strategy. Right, of course, mumbles the young senator, making a mental note to keep his mouth shut during important meetings. But you know what's really remarkable about this scene? Despite all the obvious problems, despite the unprecedented technical challenges, despite the staggering cost, and the complete lack of any previous experience with projects of this scale, the room doesn't erupt in laughter. These men don't dismiss Appius as a dreamer or a fool, because they're Romans, and Romans have a fundamental belief that any problem can be solved through a combination of engineering determination and sheer bloody-mindedness. So, says Marcus Skepticus, assuming we approve this project, who gets the credit when it works? Well, naturally, as the proposing censor, my name would be associated with the project, says Appius. And who gets the blame when it doesn't work? Asks Gaius Claudius. Oh, probably the engineers, says Appius without hesitation. That's why we hire them. And what do we call this hypothetical artificial river? Asks Lucius Practical. I was thinking Aqua Appia, says Appius. You know after me. The audacity is breathtaking. The man is proposing to spend the equivalent of a kingdom's ransom on an untested engineering project, and he's already planning to name it after himself. It's the kind of move that would make a modern politician blush, except that in ancient Rome, shameless self-promotion was considered a political virtue. "Any other questions?" asks Appius, looking around the room. "Just one," says Marcus Skepticus. "When do we start?" And that remarkably is how the Roman Empire committed itself to the most ambitious civil engineering project in human history. Not through careful feasibility studies or detailed cost-benefit analyses, but through a combination of desperate need, Roman confidence, and one man's absolute certainty that anything worth doing was worth doing on an impossibly grand scale. The meeting breaks up with the kind of determined optimism that characterizes the early stages of every doomed project. Everyone involved is convinced that their particular expertise will be the key to success. The politicians are convinced that their oversight will keep the project on track. The engineers are convinced that their skills will overcome any technical challenges. The accountants are convinced that their budgets are realistic. None of them has any idea what they've just committed themselves to. None of them realizes that they've just launched a project that will take decades to complete, cost more than anyone can imagine, and require innovations in engineering, project management, and logistics that won't be equaled for over 1,000 years. But then again, if they had realized all of that, they probably would have just kept praying for rain. So you've just committed to building the ancient world's equivalent of a moon landing program, and now comes the fun part, figuring out who's going to pay for it and who's actually going to do the work. Welcome to the wonderful world of Roman project financing, where the budget is made up and the deadlines don't matter. Let's start with everyone's favorite topic, money. Where exactly do you get the funds to build an 11-mile artificial river when your entire economic system is based on farming conquest and hoping your neighbors don't invade while you're busy with construction projects? The Roman approach to public works financing was, shall we say, creative. It was a delicate blend of taxation, extortion, voluntary contributions, and what we might charitably call aggressive fundraising. Think of it as a GoFundMe campaign, except instead of cute pictures and emotional appeals, you had armed tax collectors and the implied threat that not contributing might be interpreted as a lack of patriotic enthusiasm. First, there were the regular taxes. Romans paid taxes on property, on imports, on sales, on inheritances, and on pretty much anything else that could be measured, counted, or assessed by someone with a scroll and a bad attitude. The tax collectors, or publicani, were private contractors who bid for the right to collect taxes in specific regions. They were essentially the Sabre Corporation of the ancient world, selling you services you didn't want while charging you fees that seemed designed by someone who hated both mathematics and human happiness. Here's how the publicani system worked. The Roman government would announce that they needed, say, 1 million denarii in taxes from the province of Gaul. Private companies would bid for the contract, offering to collect that money in exchange for the right to keep everything they collected above the base amount. So if a publicani company bid to collect 1 million denarii, but actually managed to squeeze 1.5 million out of the taxpayers, they kept the extra 500,000 as profit. You can imagine how this system encouraged careful, restrained tax collection. It was like hiring a fox to guard your hen house and paying him based on how many chickens went missing. The publicani were universally despised, which is probably why Jesus had such harsh words for tax collectors. They were the ancient equivalent of those guys who call you during dinner to sell you extended warranties for appliances you don't own. But regular taxation, even with the creative markup strategies of the publicani, wasn't going to be enough to fund something as expensive as the aqua appia. For that, you needed special assessments, emergency taxes, and what Romans euphemistically called voluntary contributions from wealthy citizens. The voluntary contribution system was a masterpiece of social engineering. Wealthy Romans were expected to contribute to public works projects as a matter of civic duty and social status. It was called the liturgy system, and it worked on the principle that rich people would rather spend money on public projects than be seen as cheapskates by their peers. Think of it as ancient virtue, signaling, except instead of posting on social media, you built public fountains. The really wealthy citizens, the ones who owned vast estates and commanded private armies, were expected to fund entire sections of major projects. They got their names carved into stone coins minted with their faces and the undying gratitude of a city that would remember their generosity for centuries. It was the ultimate PR campaign: spend a fortune on infrastructure and history will remember you as a visionary leader instead of just another rich guy who happened to live during interesting times. Of course, not all contributions were entirely voluntary. Roman officials had subtle ways of encouraging generosity. They might mention purely in passing that a particular wealthy citizen hadn't contributed to any public works lately. They might wonder aloud whether someone's tax assessments were entirely accurate. They might note that certain trade licenses were coming up for renewal, and wouldn't it be wonderful if the renewal process could be expedited for particularly civic-minded citizens? It was extortion with excellent manners and impressive architecture. Then there were the spoils of war. Roman military campaigns were essentially economic enterprises disguised as patriotic endeavors. The goal wasn't just to defeat enemies and expand territory, it was to bring back enough gold, silver slaves, and valuable goods to fund the next round of public works projects. A successful campaign against the Gauls might bring back enough wealth to fund the first phase of aqueduct construction. A victorious war against the Samnites could pay for the surveying and initial excavation. This created an interesting feedback loop. Military success funded public works, which improved the quality of life in Rome, which attracted more citizens and soldiers, which enabled more military campaigns, which funded more public works. It was a pyramid scheme, except instead of selling cosmetics or supplements, you were selling the promise of clean water and the glory of empire. But even with all these funding sources, Roman projects had a way of going over budget that would make modern defense contractors weep with envy. The Aqua Appia was initially estimated to cost about as much as a moderately successful military campaign. By the time it was finished, it had cost about as much as conquering Sicily, sacking Carthage, and throwing a really impressive triumph parade. This brings us to the second major challenge: finding people to actually do the work. You might assume that Roman construction projects were built entirely by slaves dragging massive stones while being whipped by cruel overseers. That's the Hollywood version, and like most Hollywood versions of history, it's dramatically oversimplified. The reality of Roman construction crews was much more complex, and frankly, much more interesting. Yes, slaves were involved, but they were just one part of a diverse workforce that included free citizens, paid craftsmen, military engineers, foreign specialists, and what we might call independent contractors. The skilled work, the stuff that required actual expertise, was done by free craftsmen who commanded good wages and considerable respect. Stone carvers, hydraulic engineers, surveyors, and architects were the ancient equivalent of software engineers or aerospace technicians. They had specialized knowledge that couldn't be replaced by unskilled labor, and they knew it. They formed guilds, negotiated contracts, and generally behaved like any other skilled professional class. These craftsmen were recruited from all over the Mediterranean world. The Romans were remarkably practical about expertise. If someone in Greece had figured out how to cut marble more efficiently, they hired Greeks. If someone in Syria had developed better concrete techniques, they hired Syrians. If someone in Gaul had invented a new type of water wheel, they hired Gauls. Ethnicity was less important than competence, which was surprisingly progressive for an empire built on conquest. The semi-skilled work, the jobs that required some training but not years of apprenticeship, was done by a mix of free citizens and slaves. These were the people who moved materials, dug trenches, built scaffolding, and generally did the physically demanding work that made up the bulk of any construction project. Free citizens were paid wages, provided with food and lodging, and given the kind of job security that came from working on a project that was expected to last for decades. Slaves, contrary to popular belief, weren't just brutalized laborers worked to death for the glory of Rome. Skilled slaves were valuable investments who represented years of training and significant financial resources. killing them through overwork or neglect was like destroying expensive machinery, wasteful and counterproductive. Smart Roman contractors treated their skilled slaves well, provided them with decent living conditions, and often gave them opportunities to earn their freedom through exceptional service. Unskilled slaves admittedly had a rougher time. They did the dangerous work, the back-breaking labor that nobody else wanted to do. But even they were protected by economic reality. Dead slaves had to be replaced, and replacement slaves cost money. It was cheaper to keep workers alive and reasonably healthy than to constantly recruit new ones. The military engineers were in a category of their own. These were career soldiers who had specialized in construction and logistics. They knew how to build bridges under fire, construct siege works under pressure, and manage supply lines across hostile territory. For them, building an aqueduct was just another engineering challenge, albeit one where the main enemies were gravity geology and bureaucracy instead of barbarian armies. These engineers brought military discipline to civilian construction projects. They understood chain of command logistics planning and the importance of meeting deadlines when failure meant that people died. They also understood that sometimes you had to improvise, adapt, and overcome obstacles that weren't covered in any manual, because the enemy, whether human or hydraulic, rarely followed your carefully laid plans. But here's where Roman project management gets really interesting. They had to coordinate all of these different types of workers with their different skill levels, different languages, different cultural backgrounds, and different employment arrangements, without any of the communication tools we take for granted today. No email, no phones, no project management software, no Slack channels where people could argue about deadlines and complain about their coworkers. Just human messengers carrying written orders, verbal instructions passed down through chains of command, and the hope that everyone understood what they were supposed to be doing. The Romans developed what was essentially the world's first comprehensive project management system. They divided large projects into smaller, manageable sections, each with its own supervisor and crew. They established clear hierarchies of authority and responsibility. They created standardized procedures for everything from mixing concrete to calculating gradients. They developed quality control systems, safety protocols, and dispute resolution mechanisms. They also developed the world's first comprehensive bureaucracy for managing construction projects. There were officials responsible for procurement, officials responsible for logistics, officials responsible for quality control, and officials responsible for managing the officials who were responsible for everything else. It was like a Renaissance painting of organizational charts, except with more togas and significantly higher chances of being sacrificed to the gods if things went wrong. The procurement process alone was a masterpiece of ancient logistics. Someone had to source millions of tons of stone transported from quarries that might be dozens of miles away. Someone had to arrange for the production and delivery of lime, for concrete timber, for scaffolding iron, for tools, and food for workers. Someone had to negotiate contracts with suppliers, arrange for transportation, manage inventory, and ensure that materials arrived at the right place, at the right time, in the right quantities. All of this had to be coordinated across an 11-mile construction zone through terrain that ranged from easy to impossible, using transportation methods that hadn't changed significantly since the Bronze Age. Ox carts, pack animals, and human labor were the sum total of Roman logistics technology. No trucks, no cranes, no conveyor belts. Just animals, people, and the occasional clever use of pulleys and ramps. The Romans also had to deal with what modern project managers would recognize as scope creep. The original plan for the Aqua Appia was relatively simple: find water, build channel, deliver water to city. But as construction progressed, new requirements kept emerging. The water pressure wasn't sufficient for certain areas of the city. The distribution system needed to be expanded. The settling tanks needed to be larger. The maintenance access needed to be improved. Each change required additional funding, additional labor, additional materials, and additional time. The Romans handled this the same way modern contractors do. They complained bitterly, demanded additional compensation, and then figured out how to make it work, because the alternative was admitting failure in front of their peers. The labor relations were particularly complex. Free workers could quit if they didn't like the working conditions or the pay. Slaves couldn't quit, but they could work slowly, break tools, or find creative ways to sabotage projects they didn't support. Foreign workers might not understand the language or the local customs. Military engineers might clash with civilian contractors over proper procedures and chain of command. The Romans dealt with these challenges through a combination of clear rules, fair treatment, and the occasional dramatic execution to encourage the others. They established standardized wages for different types of work. They provided food, lodging, and medical care for workers. They created systems for resolving disputes and addressing grievances. They also made it clear that certain types of misconduct would result in punishments that made crucifixion look like a pleasant retirement option. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Roman construction management was their approach to problem solving. When they encountered obstacles that hadn't been anticipated, they didn't call committee meetings or hire consultants to study the issue. They improvised, experimented, and adapted their plans based on what they learned from trial and error. If the original route proved impossible, they found a new route. If the planned construction techniques didn't work, they invented new techniques. If the available materials weren't suitable, they figured out how to modify the materials or change the design. The Roman approach to engineering challenges was essentially, well, that didn't work. Let's try something else. This pragmatic flexibility was both a strength and a weakness. It allowed Roman engineers to overcome obstacles that would have stopped more rigid civilizations. It also meant that Roman projects had a tendency to evolve in unexpected directions with final results that bore only passing resemblance to the original plans. The Aqua Appia that was eventually completed was longer, more expensive, more complex, and more sophisticated than anything Appius Claudius had originally envisioned. It was also more reliable, more durable, and more capable than anyone had thought possible. It was a perfect example of Roman engineering philosophy. Start with an impossible goal, figure out how to make it slightly less impossible, and keep improvising until you achieve something that's actually better than what you originally planned. By the time construction began in earnest, the Aqua Appia project had a workforce that included thousands of people from dozens of different backgrounds, a budget that had already tripled from the original estimates, and a timeline that existed more in hope than in reality. In other words, it was a perfectly typical Roman construction project, ready to begin the long, chaotic, expensive process of turning an impossible dream into an improbable reality. Now we come to the unsung heroes of Roman engineering, the people who made the impossible possible through sheer obsessive mind-numbing attention to detail. Ladies and gentlemen, meet the Roman surveyors, or as they called themselves, the librators and grammatici. These were the people who had to figure out how to build a gently sloping artificial river across 11 miles of hills, valleys, forests, and whatever else the Italian countryside could throw at them. Imagine you're a Roman surveyor in 312 BCE. Your job is to ensure that water flows consistently downhill over a distance that would take you half a day to walk. Maintaining a gradient so precise that a difference of a few inches over a mile could mean the difference between a functioning aqueduct and the world's most expensive decorative ditch. Your tools are essentially a wooden frame with some weights hanging from it, a water level that works on sunny days if the wind isn't too strong, and your own 2 eyes. Oh, and if you get it wrong, you'll probably be blamed for wasting enough money to fund a small war. No pressure. Let's talk about the tools of the trade, because Roman surveying equipment was both ingenious and terrifyingly primitive by modern standards. The primary instrument was called a groma, which looked like a wooden cross mounted on a pole with lead weights hanging from each arm. It was used for establishing right angles and straight lines, and it was about as sophisticated as a coat hanger, with some fishing weights attached to it. The groma worked on the principle that gravity always pulls straight down, so if you hung weights from perpendicular arms, you could use the plumb lines to establish perfect right angles. It was simple, reliable, and completely useless in strong wind. Roman surveyors learned to work in the early morning hours when the air was still, because trying to take precise measurements while your plumb lines were swinging around like drunken dancers was an exercise in futility. For measuring elevation changes, they used an instrument called a corabets, which was essentially a 20-foot wooden beam with legs, water channels, and plumb lines. It was like a carpenter's level, designed by someone who had never heard of the concept of portable. The corabets required a team of assistants to carry and operate, and setting it up on rough terrain was like trying to balance a dining room table on a mountainside. But here's the thing about Roman surveyors: they were incredibly, obsessively, almost pathologically precise. They understood that small errors compound over long distances, so they developed procedures and cross-checking methods that would make a modern accountant weep with admiration. They measured everything multiple times from multiple angles using multiple methods, and they documented every measurement with the kind of meticulous detail that suggests either professional dedication or mild insanity. A Roman surveyor's notebook, if any had survived, would read like the world's most boring diary. Day 47. Confirmed elevation at milestone 3, using Corabate's method. Reading consistent with previous measurements. Gradient holding steady at 0.2%. Adjusted for thermal expansion of bronze measuring rod. Note: local tribal chief still suspicious of surveying activities. Recommend diplomatic gift of wine. They had to deal with problems that modern surveyors can't even imagine. No GPS, obviously. No satellite imagery. No topographical maps. No weather forecasts. No reliable way to communicate with other survey teams working on different sections of the route. They were essentially making it up as they went along, using instruments that would be considered primitive by medieval standards, working across terrain that ranged from merely difficult to genuinely life-threatening. And they had to do all of this while maintaining a gradient of approximately 0.2% over the entire length of the aqueduct. To put that in perspective, that's a drop of about 2 feet per mile. Too steep, and the water would flow too fast, eroding the channel and potentially destroying the entire system. Too shallow, and the water would barely move, creating stagnant pools that would become breeding grounds for disease and mosquitoes. But measuring a 0.2% gradient across 11 miles of varied terrain using primitive instruments with no way to verify your calculations until the water actually starts flowing is like trying to thread a needle while riding a horse during an earthquake. It requires not just technical skill, but the kind of obsessive perfectionism that borders on mental illness. Roman surveyors developed their own culture, their own traditions, their own professional pride. They were the Dwight Schrutes of the ancient world, absolutely convinced that their way of doing things was the only correct way, and prepared to explain in excruciating detail why everyone else's methods were inferior. They formed professional associations, passed down secret techniques from master to apprentice, and generally behaved like any other group of specialists who possessed knowledge that nobody else understood or appreciated. They also developed what we might call the world's first comprehensive surveying methodology. Roman surveying wasn't just about pointing instruments and taking measurements. It was about understanding terrain, predicting seasonal changes, accounting for geological variations, and planning for problems that hadn't happened yet. A Roman surveyor planning an aqueduct route had to consider not just the shortest distance between 2 points, but the most practical distance. They had to account for seasonal flooding, soil stability, rock formations, property ownership, tribal territories, and military considerations. They couldn't just draw a straight line on a map. They had to find a route that could actually be built, maintained, and defended. This meant that Roman surveying expeditions were part scientific mission, part military reconnaissance, and part diplomatic embassy. The surveyors didn't just measure elevations, they negotiated with local landowners, assessed potential threats, evaluated available resources, and gathered intelligence about local conditions that might affect construction. Imagine you're part of a Roman surveying expedition in the hills outside Rome. You wake up before dawn because that's when the air is still enough to use your instruments accurately. You eat a quick breakfast of bread, cheese, and watered wine because alcohol was considered safer than local water sources. You load your equipment onto pack animals that are already complaining about the wait and the early hour. Then you hike to your assigned section of the planned route, set up your instruments, and begin the slow, methodical process of measuring everything. distance, elevation gradient, soil composition, wind direction, water sources, potential obstacles, and anything else that might be relevant to construction planning. You work in a team of 3 or 4 people because precision surveying is impossible with fewer people and chaotic with more. One person operates the instruments, one person records measurements, one person handles the measuring chains and rods, and one person watches for bandits, wild animals, or hostile locals who might object to foreigners tramping around their territory with mysterious equipment. The work is physically demanding, mentally exhausting, and often dangerous. You're hiking through rough terrain, carrying heavy equipment, working with precision instruments that require steady hands and clear thinking. You're exposed to weather, wildlife, and the constant possibility that your calculations are wrong and you'll have to start over. But the real challenge isn't physical, it's psychological. You're working on a project that will take years to complete, and you won't know if your work is correct until the very end, when the water either flows or doesn't. Every measurement you take, every calculation you make, every decision about route planning has to be perfect, because there's no margin for error in a project this ambitious. Roman surveyors dealt with this pressure by developing an almost religious devotion to their craft. They believed that precision was a virtue, that accurate measurement was a form of service to the state, and that their work was essential to the glory and prosperity of Rome. They were the kind of people who measured their own garden plots for fun and could spot a crooked fence post from half a mile away. They also developed what modern psychologists would recognize as coping mechanisms for dealing with the stress of perfectionism. They created rituals and ceremonies around their work, performed sacrifices to ensure accurate measurements, and maintained detailed records that serve both practical and psychological functions. Writing down every measurement, every calculation, every observation helped them feel confident that they hadn't missed anything important. The surveying phase of the Aqua Appia project took almost 2 years, which seems like an eternity until you consider what they were actually doing. They were mapping 11 miles of terrain with an accuracy that wouldn't be equaled until the invention of modern surveying instruments. They were calculating gradients, designing route alternatives, identifying potential problems, and creating the detailed plans that would guide thousands of workers for the next decade. When they were finished, they had produced what was essentially the world's first comprehensive engineering survey. They had identified the optimal route, calculated the required gradients, located sources of construction materials, identified potential obstacles, and created detailed specifications for every aspect of the construction process. They had also driven themselves nearly insane with the stress of perfectionism, developed severe cases of obsessive-compulsive disorder, and probably shortened their lifespans through exposure to weather-dangerous terrain and the constant anxiety of knowing that entire project depended on their calculations being correct. But here's the remarkable thing: they got it right. When the Aqua Appia was finally completed, water flowed exactly as the surveyors had predicted. The gradient was perfect, the route was practical, and the engineering specifications were so accurate that the aqueduct functioned reliably for over 400 years. The Roman surveyors had accomplished something that wouldn't be equaled until the Renaissance. They had used primitive instruments and pure human skill to achieve a level of precision that bordered on the miraculous. They had proven that obsessive attention to detail combined with professional pride and sheer stubborn determination could overcome almost any technical challenge. They were, in short, exactly the kind of people you want, designing your infrastructure, meticulous, dedicated, slightly obsessive, and absolutely convinced that their way of doing things is the only way that works. They were the Dwight Schrutis of the Roman world, and thank the gods for that. Because without their obsessive perfectionism, the aqueducts would never have worked, and Roman civilization as we know it would never have been possible. Welcome to the ancient world's most ambitious construction site, where safety regulations were more like safety suggestions and workplace accident was just another way of saying Tuesday. If a modern OSHA inspector could travel back in time to a Roman aqueduct construction site, they would probably faint then wake up, take one look around, and faint again. Then they'd spend the rest of their visit frantically writing citations that would bankrupt the entire Roman Empire. Picture this, it's 310 BCE and you're standing at what will eventually become mile marker 7 of the Aqua Appia. The air is thick with dust from stone, cutting the sound of hammers on chisels echoes off the hills, and somewhere in the distance someone is screaming. Whether that screaming is from excitement, frustration, or genuine medical emergency is anyone's guess, and frankly, nobody has time to find out. The construction site stretches as far as you can see in both directions, a 11-mile-long scar across the Italian countryside, where thousands of workers are simultaneously digging, building, hauling, lifting, and trying not to die in the process. It's like the world's longest assembly line, except instead of making cars, they're making an artificial river, and instead of quality control stations, they have altars where workers pray to various gods for protection from falling rocks. Let's start with the quarries, because every great Roman construction project begins with the simple question, where are we going to get several million tons of stone? The Romans had identified suitable limestone deposits in the nearby hills, which was good news for the project, and terrible news for the landscape. Roman quarrying techniques were effective, efficient, and environmentally catastrophic. The process began with teams of workers called lapicidi stone cutters, who specialized in extracting usable blocks from solid rock. Their tools were simple iron hammers, bronze chisels, wooden wedges, and an intimate understanding of how stone breaks under pressure. They would identify natural fractures in the rock, drive wooden wedges into the cracks, then soak the wedges with water until they expanded, and split the stone along predictable lines. It was ingenious, it was effective, and it was incredibly dangerous. Workers spent their days hanging from ropes on cliff faces, hammering wedges into cracks while trying not to fall into the quarry below. The lucky ones died quickly from falling rocks. The unlucky ones survived long enough to develop what we would now recognize as silicosis, a lung disease caused by breathing stone dust that was essentially a delayed death sentence. Roman workplace safety policy was straightforward. Try not to die, and if you do die, try to do it in a way that doesn't damage the equipment. There were no hard hats, no safety harnesses, no protective equipment of any kind. Workers wore whatever clothes they owned, used whatever tools they could afford, and hoped that the gods were feeling benevolent that day. The Romans did, however, understand the economic value of keeping workers alive. Dead workers had to be replaced, and replacement workers required training, which cost time and money. So while they didn't have safety regulations in the modern sense, they did have practical guidelines based on bitter experience. Don't stand directly under someone who's hammering on rock. Don't work alone in areas where a collapse could trap you. Don't drink the water from streams that run through the work zones because it's probably contaminated with stone dust and human waste. Once the stone was extracted from the quarries, it had to be transported to the construction sites, which presented its own set of challenges. Roman transportation technology was basically unchanged from the Bronze Age ox carts, pack animals, and human labor. Moving millions of tons of stone across rough terrain without roads, using animals that were frequently uncooperative and humans who were increasingly exhausted, was a logistical nightmare that would make a modern supply chain manager weep. The Romans solved this problem through what can only be described as brute force logistics. They built temporary roads to connect quarries with construction sites. They established supply depots at regular intervals along the route. They organized transportation crews into efficient teams with specialized roles and responsibilities. They basically invented modern logistics management, except with more oxen and significantly higher mortality rates. At the construction sites themselves, the work was divided into several distinct phases, each with its own unique hazards and challenges. First came the excavation, where teams of workers dug channels, trenches, and foundation pits, according to the surveyor's specifications. This was backbreaking work that required precision as well as brute strength, because the excavations had to match the planned gradients exactly, or the entire system would fail. Roman excavation crews worked with tools that would be familiar to any modern gardener: shovels, picks, mattocks, and wheelbarrows. The difference was scale and precision. They were digging an 11-mile-long trench that had to maintain a consistent gradient of 0.2% using tools that hadn't changed significantly since the Stone Age, without any of the measuring equipment that modern construction crews take for granted. The dirt and debris from excavation had to go somewhere, so the Romans developed what was probably the world's first comprehensive waste management system for construction sites. Usable soil was saved for backfilling and landscaping. Stone and gravel were sorted and stockpiled for use in concrete and foundations. Everything else was hauled away to designated dumping areas that were carefully located to avoid contaminating water sources or blocking transportation routes. Then came the foundation work, which required a combination of engineering skill and construction craftsmanship that wouldn't be equaled for centuries. Roman foundations were built to last, and the evidence is that they succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Many Roman foundations are still supporting structures today, more than 2,000 years later. The key to Roman foundation construction was their concrete, or opus cementitium, which was arguably the most important technological innovation of the ancient world. Roman concrete was a mixture of lime mortar, water, and aggregate, usually volcanic ash or crushed stone. It was stronger, more durable, and more water-resistant than anything that had been invented before, and it wouldn't be equaled until the development of Portland cement in the 19th century. But mixing and pouring concrete on an ancient construction site was an art form that bordered on black magic. The proportions had to be exact, the mixing had to be thorough, and the pouring had to be completed quickly before the concrete began to set. Roman concrete crews worked in carefully coordinated teams with specialized roles for each member. One person measured ingredients, one person mixed the concrete, one person transported it to the pouring site, and one person spread and smoothed it into place. The mixing was done by hand in large wooden troughs by workers who stood waist-deep in wet concrete and stirred it with long wooden paddles. It was exhausting, messy, and dangerous work because wet concrete is caustic and can cause severe chemical burns on exposed skin. Roman concrete workers developed thick calluses on their hands and arms, and probably suffered from chronic skin problems that nobody understood or knew how to treat. The really dangerous work began when they started building the actual aqueduct structures, the channels, the bridges, the tunnels, and the distribution systems. This required working at height in confined spaces with heavy materials, using construction techniques that were being invented on the spot. Roman scaffolding was built from wooden poles lashed together with rope, creating towering structures that swayed in the wind and creaked ominously under the weight of workers and materials. Climbing these scaffolds was like rock climbing, except the rocks were trying to kill you, and there was no safety equipment. Workers carried heavy stones, buckets of concrete, and construction tools up rickety ladders, while trying not to look down at the ground, which seemed to get farther away with each step. The arch construction was particularly hazardous because it required building temporary wooden frameworks called centering, then constructing the stone arches on top of the framework, then removing the framework and hoping that the arch would support itself. If the calculations were wrong, or if the concrete hadn't set properly, or if someone had made a mistake in the stone cutting, the entire arch would collapse, probably taking several workers with it. Roman engineers dealt with this risk through a combination of careful planning and ritual sacrifice. They calculated the loads, designed the frameworks, and selected the stones with obsessive attention to detail. They also performed elaborate ceremonies before removing the centering, offering prayers and sacrifices to ensure that the gods would protect the arch from collapse. The tunnel work was perhaps the most dangerous of all because it combined all the hazards of mining with all the precision requirements of construction engineering. Roman tunnel workers, called fossores, spent their days underground in narrow, poorly ventilated spaces, digging through rock and soil while trying to maintain the exact gradient required for water flow. Tunneling was done entirely by hand, using picks, chisels, and oil lamps for light. The workers advanced slowly, carefully checking their measurements constantly to ensure they were following the planned route. Cave-ins were a constant threat. Ventilation was always inadequate, and the workers had no way of knowing if they were digging in the right direction until they emerged at the other end. The Romans developed ingenious solutions to tunneling challenges. They dug shafts at regular intervals to provide ventilation and access points. They used surveying techniques to ensure that tunnel sections dug from opposite ends would meet in the middle. They developed methods for supporting tunnel roofs with wooden beams and stone arches. But even with all their innovations, tunneling remained extremely dangerous work. Roman tunnel workers had shorter lifespans than almost any other occupation, and it wasn't unusual for entire crews to be lost in cave-ins or underground floods. The Romans accepted these casualties as a necessary cost of empire building and simply recruited new workers to replace the ones who didn't survive. Throughout all of this construction activity, the Romans maintained what can only be described as organized chaos. Thousands of workers, dozens of specialized crews, multiple construction sites operating simultaneously, all coordinated through a management system that relied entirely on human messengers and written orders. There were no radios, no phones, no computer systems, no project management software, just people scrolls and the hope that everyone understood what they were supposed to be doing. The Romans dealt with this challenge by developing the world's first comprehensive construction management system. They divided the project into manageable sections, each with its own supervisors and specialized crews. They established clear chains of command and responsibility. They created standardized procedures for everything from mixing concrete to cutting stone. They developed quality control systems, inspection procedures, and methods for documenting progress. They also developed what was probably the world's first construction safety culture. Not safety regulations in the modern sense, but shared understanding of best practices, common sense precautions, and mutual responsibility for preventing accidents. Experienced workers taught newcomers how to avoid common hazards. Supervisors were expected to watch for dangerous situations and intervene before someone got hurt. Work crews looked out for each other because everyone understood that accidents affected the entire team. The result was a construction site that was simultaneously incredibly dangerous and remarkably efficient. Workers died regularly from falls, cave-ins, equipment failures, and exposure to hazardous materials. But the work continued, the project progressed, and eventually the impossible became reality. Water flowed through an artificial stone river across 11 miles of Italian countryside, delivered to the city of Rome with a precision that wouldn't be equaled for over 1,000 years. It was a monument to human ingenuity, determination, and the willingness to risk everything for the sake of clean water and imperial glory. It was also a reminder that every great achievement in human history has been built on the backs of people who were willing to do dangerous, difficult work for the benefit of future generations who would probably never know their names. Every great project has its moment of crisis, that pivotal point where everything that can go wrong does go wrong, usually simultaneously, and preferably at the worst possible moment. For the Aqua Appia, that moment came in year 4 of construction, when someone finally noticed that the water wasn't going to flow uphill, no matter how much money they threw at the problem. Picture this scene, it's 308 BCE, and you're standing in what will eventually become the most tense meeting in Roman engineering history. The location is a hastily erected tent at mile marker 6, where the surveying crews have discovered something that makes every engineer's blood run cold. Their calculations are wrong. Not slightly wrong, not "we can fix this with a minor adjustment" wrong, but catastrophically, project-threateningly, "we might have to start over from scratch" wrong. The meeting includes Gaius Plautius, the chief engineer, a man who has spent the last 4 years confidently telling everyone that Roman engineering can overcome any obstacle. Marcus Surveyor, the lead librator who is currently experiencing what we might charitably call a professional crisis of confidence. Lucius, budget keeper, the financial overseer who is doing mental calculations that seem to involve increasingly large numbers and increasingly creative accounting methods. And Appius Claudius himself, the original visionary, who is beginning to suspect that his name will be remembered by history for all the wrong reasons. Explain to me again, says Appius in the carefully controlled voice of a man who is trying very hard not to commit murder, how we managed to spend 4 years and several million denarii building an artificial river that flows backward. Well, begins Marcus Surveyor, consulting his scrolls with the desperate hope that the numbers might have changed since the last time he looked at them. It's not exactly flowing backward. It's more like not flowing forward as much as we anticipated. Not flowing forward, repeats Gaius Plaudius. Not flowing forward. What you're telling me is that the water reaches mile marker 5 and then just stops. It doesn't stop exactly, Marcus says, sweating despite the cool morning air. It pools. It forms a kind of decorative lake, which, if you think about it, could be quite attractive from an aesthetic standpoint. The silence that follows this statement is the kind of silence that occurs when intelligent people realize they're listening to someone desperately trying to avoid taking responsibility for a disaster of epic proportions. A decorative lake, says Lucius Budget Keeper slowly. We've spent 4 years building the world's most expensive decorative lake. It's a temporary setback, Marcus insists. We can fix this. We just need to adjust the gradient. Adjust the gradient, repeats Appius, on an 11-mile aqueduct that's already half built. Do you have any idea what that would involve? As it turns out, Marcus does have an idea, and it's the kind of idea that makes grown engineers weep. Adjusting the gradient would require tearing down and rebuilding approximately 6 miles of completed aqueduct, re-excavating the channels to new specifications, recalculating the stone requirements, and basically starting over with everything they've learned from 4 years of expensive mistakes. The financial implications are staggering. The original budget, which had already tripled from the initial estimates, would need to triple again. The timeline, which had already been extended twice due to unforeseen circumstances, would need to be extended by at least another 5 years. The political implications were even worse. Senators were already asking uncomfortable questions about cost overruns, and several rival politicians were suggesting that the whole project should be abandoned as a monument to fiscal irresponsibility. How, asks Appius, did nobody notice this problem until now? It's the question that everyone has been dreading, because the answer reveals the fundamental flaw in Roman project management. They were making it up as they went along, and sometimes that meant making crucial mistakes that weren't discovered until it was too late to fix them easily. The problem, as Marcus reluctantly explains, is that Roman surveying techniques were incredibly precise over short distances, but accumulated errors over long distances. Each individual measurement was accurate to within a few inches, but small errors in each measurement compounded over 11 miles until the total error was several feet. It was like playing telephone with mathematics. Each person repeated the message correctly, but somehow the final message bore no resemblance to the original. The Romans had also underestimated the geological challenges of their chosen route. The ground wasn't as stable as they had assumed, which meant that some sections of the aqueduct had settled more than expected. The seasonal flooding was worse than anticipated, which had required several course corrections that altered the overall gradient. And there had been what Lucius Budget Keeper diplomatically calls scope creep, where local officials had requested modifications to serve additional neighborhoods, each of which required changes to the water distribution system. But the real problem, the one that nobody wants to admit, is that they had been so focused on solving individual engineering challenges that they had lost sight of the overall system. Each crew had been working to meet their specific requirements without fully understanding how their work affected the project as a whole. It was like building a car by having one team design the engine, another team design the wheels, and a third team design the steering system, without anyone checking to make sure all the parts would work together. So what are our options? Asks Appius. The options, as Gaius Plaudius explains them, are all terrible in different ways. Option 1, tear down 6 miles of completed aqueduct and rebuild it correctly, which would cost a fortune and take years, but would ultimately result in a functional water system. Option 2, abandon the project entirely, which would be politically disastrous, but would stop the financial bleeding. Option 3, try to fix the gradient problem with creative engineering solutions that had never been attempted before and might not work. What kind of creative engineering solutions? Asks Lucius, budget keeper, with the tone of a man who is already calculating the cost. Gaius Plautius unfurls what might be the first engineering diagram in history to feature the phrase, "and then a miracle occurs." His proposal involves building a series of drop towers, essentially vertical sections, where the water would fall rapidly to lose elevation connected by horizontal sections that would carry the water forward. It's ingenious, it's unprecedented, and it's almost certainly impossible to build with Roman construction technology. "You want to build waterfalls," says Appius. "Controlled waterfalls," corrects Gaius. "Think of them as vertical aqueducts." The room falls silent again as everyone tries to visualize what a vertical aqueduct would actually look like. The mental image is simultaneously impressive and terrifying: massive stone towers with water cascading down through carefully engineered channels, creating a system that would be part engineering marvel and part elaborate fountain display. "Has anyone ever built a vertical aqueduct before?" asks Marcus Surveyor. "No," admits Gaius, "but has anyone ever built an 11-mile horizontal aqueduct before? We're already making history. We might as well make really interesting history." It's at this point that Lucius, budget keeper, makes the mistake of asking about cost estimates for the vertical aqueduct solution. The numbers that Gaius provides are so large that they require new methods of mathematical notation. Building the drop towers would require quarrying and transporting stone blocks larger than anything the Romans had ever moved. The engineering challenges would require inventing new construction techniques. The timeline would extend the project by at least another decade. "So let me understand this," says Appius. "Our options are spend another fortune to tear down and rebuild what we've already built, abandon the project and admit failure, or spend an even larger fortune to build something that has never been attempted before and might not work." "That's a fair summary," agrees Gaius. "And there's no fourth option, no simple solution that we've overlooked." "Well," says Marcus hesitantly, "there is one other possibility." The other possibility, as Marcus explains it, involves what he calls hydraulic compensation. Instead of trying to fix the gradient problem, they could work around it by increasing the water pressure at the source. If they could find additional springs, or if they could build a reservoir system that would store water during low demand periods and release it during high demand periods, they might be able to force enough water through the system to overcome the gradient problems. It's not a perfect solution because it doesn't address the fundamental engineering flaws, but it might be a workable solution that doesn't require tearing down everything they've already built. It would require additional construction at the source end of the aqueduct, including what amounts to the world's first water pressure management system, but it would be considerably cheaper and faster than the alternatives. "How much additional construction?" asks Lucius. "Maybe 6 months of work, a few dozen additional workers, some new stone cutting. For the reservoir system," Marcus estimates, "probably cost about as much as a small military campaign against a minor barbarian tribe." The relief in the room is palpable. A small military campaign is expensive, but it's not catastrophically expensive. 6 months is a long time, but it's not geological time. Most importantly, it's a solution that doesn't require admitting that they've spent 4 years building something that doesn't work. "And this hydraulic compensation system," asks Appius, "it will definitely solve the gradient problem." "Probably," says Marcus. "Probably." "Well, we won't know for certain until we test it with actual water flow, but the mathematical models suggest that it should work." "Mathematical models," repeats Gaius. "You mean the same mathematical models that predicted the current gradient would work?" "We've refined our calculations," Marcus says defensively. "We've identified the sources of error in our previous estimates. We've developed new measurement techniques. We've learned from our mistakes." It's the eternal promise of engineering projects. Everywhere we've learned from our mistakes, and we definitely won't make the same mistakes again. We might make completely new and different mistakes, but we've definitely learned from the old ones. The meeting breaks up with the kind of cautious optimism that characterizes the middle phase of every doomed project. Everyone involved is convinced that the hydraulic compensation system will work because the alternative is too terrible to contemplate. The politicians are convinced that 6 months is a reasonable extension to the timeline. The engineers are convinced that their refined calculations are accurate. The budget managers are convinced that the additional costs are manageable. None of them wants to ask the obvious question, what happens if the hydraulic compensation system doesn't work? What if the refined calculations are wrong? What if they're just throwing good money after bad, postponing the inevitable admission that the whole project is based on faulty assumptions? But that's the thing about Roman engineering projects. They succeeded, not because the Romans never made mistakes, but because they were absolutely determined to make their mistakes work. When they encountered problems that couldn't be solved with conventional techniques, they invented unconventional techniques. When their calculations were wrong, they found ways to work around the mathematical limitations. When their original plans proved inadequate, they modified the plans, changed the specifications, and generally refused to admit defeat. The hydraulic compensation system that emerged from this crisis was actually a remarkable piece of engineering. The Romans built a series of settling tanks and distribution chambers that not only solved the immediate pressure problems, but also created the world's first sophisticated water treatment and distribution system. They developed techniques for managing water pressure that wouldn't be equaled until the Industrial Revolution. They created a system that was more robust, more reliable, and more adaptable than anything they had originally planned. In other words, they turned their biggest failure into their greatest success, which is probably the most Roman thing they could have done. The crisis that nearly destroyed the project ultimately made it better because it forced them to develop solutions that were more sophisticated than anything they had originally envisioned. Of course, none of this was apparent at the time. At the time, it looked like a bunch of expensive mistakes that were being covered up with even more expensive fixes. The politicians grumbled about cost overruns. The engineers worried about their professional reputations. The workers wondered if they would still have jobs if the project failed completely. But 6 months later, when the first water flowed through the completed Aqua Appia, when the fountains in Rome began flowing with clean, fresh water from the distant hills, when the public baths filled with water that was actually safe to bathe in, everyone agreed that the crisis had been worth it. The gradient problems that had seemed so catastrophic turned out to be minor inconveniences. The hydraulic compensation system worked exactly as designed. The vertical drop sections became architectural features that enhanced the beauty of the aqueduct. The additional costs were forgotten in the celebration of Roman engineering triumph, and Appius Claudius got his name carved in stone. After all, not as the man who wasted a fortune on an impossible project, but as the visionary who brought clean water to the greatest city in the world. History, as it turns out, is written by the people whose engineering projects actually work, regardless of how many crises they encountered along the way. Now let's talk about the people who actually built this thing, because while the politicians were taking credit and the engineers were solving problems, thousands of ordinary workers were spending their days covered in stone dust, concrete mix, and what we might diplomatically call construction site aromatics. These were the people who turned the impossible dream into stone and mortar reality one back-breaking day at a time. The workforce of the Aqua Appia was like a small city unto itself, a temporary community that sprang up along the construction route and moved gradually across the landscape as the work progressed. At its peak, the project employed somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 people, making it one of the largest industrial operations in the ancient world. But unlike a modern construction site where workers show up at 7 and go home at 5, the aqueduct workers lived on site in temporary camps that were part military base, part refugee settlement, and part ongoing social experiment. Let's start with a typical day in the life of Marcus Malletswinger, a stonemason from a small town near Rome, who signed up for aqueduct work because it paid better than farming and seemed more exciting than making pottery for the rest of his life. Marcus wakes up before dawn in a tent he shares with 3 other masons, because privacy is a luxury that construction workers can't afford, and individual accommodations are for people who don't work with their hands. The tent is cramped, cold, and smells like a combination of unwashed bodies' leather and the olive oil they use to waterproof their work clothes. But it's home for now, and Marcus has learned not to complain about living conditions when the alternative is sleeping in the rain. Breakfast is a bowl of poles, a thick porridge made from whatever grain is available, mixed with water and whatever protein they can afford. Sometimes it's decent with bits of meat or cheese mixed in. Sometimes it's just grain and water seasoned with hope and the faint taste of despair. The workers eat quickly because daylight is valuable and there's a lot of work to do. Marcus's job is cutting stones for the aqueduct channel, which requires skill strength and the kind of patience that comes from knowing that a poorly cut stone might cause problems for decades to come. He works with tools that would be familiar to any modern stonemason: chisels, hammers, measuring devices, and squares for checking right angles. The difference is that Marcus makes his own tools, maintains his own equipment, and replaces anything that breaks with materials he sources himself. The stone cutting is done in teams because most of the blocks are too heavy for one person to handle safely. Marcus works with his tent mates, 4 men who have learned to coordinate their movements with the precision of a dance troupe. They measure twice, cut once, and check their work obsessively, because mistakes in stone cutting are expensive and time-consuming to fix. The work is physically demanding in ways that are hard to appreciate unless you've spent a day swinging a 3-pound hammer with precision accuracy. Marcus's hands are permanently calloused, his back aches constantly, and his arms are so developed that he looks like an ancient bodybuilder. He's also covered always and completely in a fine layer of stone dust that gets into his hair, his clothes, his food, and his lungs. Roman workers didn't understand the long-term health effects of breathing stone dust, but they understood that it wasn't good for them. They developed practical coping strategies, working upwind when possible, covering their faces with cloth during particularly dusty operations, and drinking wine that they believed would help clear their lungs. Whether the wine actually helped is debatable, but it certainly made the work more tolerable. Around midday, the workers break for the main meal of the day, which is usually bread, cheese, olives, and more of that watered wine. That seems to be the universal beverage of Roman construction sites. The meal is also a social hour when workers from different crews share news, gossip, and complaints about their supervisors. This is when you start to hear the real story of the aqueduct construction, the version that doesn't appear in any official records, but was carved into tunnel walls and scrawled on storage containers by workers who wanted to leave some record of their experience. Gaius Foreman is an idiot who couldn't organize a drinking party in a vineyard. That's from a piece of broken pottery found near mile marker 4. The engineer changed his mind again. We've rebuilt this section 3 times. If he changes it again, we're going to rebuild him. That's scratched into a stone block that was later incorporated into the aqueduct wall, where you can still read it if you know where to look. Lucius from Gaul snores like a dying ox. If anyone knows how to cure snoring, please speak to his tent mates before we smother him. That's from a lead tablet that was apparently used for official communications, but was repurposed for personal complaints. The graffiti and informal writing found at Roman construction sites gives us a window into the daily lives of ordinary workers that's more honest and immediate than any official history. These people were bored, tired, frustrated, homesick, and often quite funny. They complained about their bosses, made jokes about each other, kept track of personal debts and romantic entanglements, and generally behaved like people in any workplace anywhere. Some of the inscriptions are practical, good stone in the quarry northeast of camp. Ask for Quintus, he knows which blocks are ready. Others are personal. Titus owes me 3 denarii for dice. If you see him, remind him that debts don't disappear just because you work in a different section. And some are just beautifully human. I miss my wife's cooking. The camp food tastes like it was prepared by someone who has heard of flavor but never actually experienced it. The diversity of the workforce is striking even by Roman standards. Marcus works alongside stonemasons from Rome, hydraulic engineers from Greece, concrete specialists from Naples, and laborers recruited from across the Italian peninsula. There are also foreign workers, Celtic smiths who specialize in tool making, Germanic carpenters, who know techniques for building in wet conditions, and even a few Egyptian engineers who have experience with water management in desert climates. The language situation on the construction site is like a practical experiment in ancient multiculturalism. Latin is the official language, but you hear Greek, Celtic, Germanic dialects, and regional Italian languages throughout the camps. Workers develop a kind of construction pidgin, a simplified vocabulary focused on the practical needs of coordinated labor: lift, move, measure, careful, and various words for "that's not right, start over." The foreign workers bring their own food, their own customs, and their own solutions to engineering problems. The Celtic workers introduce new techniques for working in wet conditions. The Germanic workers share methods for preserving wood in outdoor environments. The Greek workers contribute mathematical techniques for calculating complex curves and angles. This cultural exchange happens naturally through the practical needs of getting work done, but it also creates tensions. Roman workers sometimes resent foreign workers who seem to have better techniques or who work for lower wages. Foreign workers sometimes feel excluded from the informal social networks that determine who gets the best assignments and who gets blamed when things go wrong. The supervisors deal with these tensions through a combination of practical management and social engineering. Work crews are deliberately mixed so that Romans and foreigners work together and learn from each other. Social activities are organized to build camaraderie across cultural lines, and there's a clear understanding that anyone who lets ethnic prejudices interfere with the work will find themselves reassigned to the least desirable jobs on the project. The evening meal is usually a social event with workers from different crews gathering around fires to share food stories and complaints. This is when the informal knowledge transfer happens. Experienced workers teach newcomers how to avoid common mistakes, how to work efficiently, and how to stay safe in dangerous conditions. It's also when the cultural blending becomes most apparent. Roman workers learn Celtic drinking songs. Greek workers share mathematical tricks with Roman engineers. Germanic workers teach everyone better methods for maintaining tools in wet conditions. By the end of the project, many workers have picked up vocabulary in multiple languages, techniques from multiple traditions, and friendships that cross ethnic and regional boundaries. The workday doesn't end when the sun goes down, because Roman construction sites operate on something closer to a 24-hour schedule than a modern 9-to-5 routine. Some work continues by torchlight concrete mixing that needs to be completed before the material sets, emergency repairs that can't wait until morning, and security patrols that watch for thieves, saboteurs, and wild animals. The night shift workers develop their own culture, their own routines, and their own complaints. Working by torchlight is dangerous, difficult, and exhausting, but it also creates a sense of camaraderie among people who share the experience of trying to do precision work in inadequate lighting while fighting off mosquitoes, and wondering what that noise in the darkness might be. Sleep, when it finally comes, is often interrupted by the sounds of ongoing construction, the complaints of restless workers, and the general noise of several thousand people living in close quarters. Roman construction workers learn to sleep through almost anything, which is a skill that serves them well in an environment where silence is rare and privacy is non-existent. The weekend, such as it is, brings a different set of activities. Roman workers get one day off per week, usually the market day, when local merchants come to the construction site to sell food tools and other necessities. It's also when workers can visit nearby towns, send messages to their families, and generally remember that there's a world beyond the construction site. Some workers use their time off to supplement their income with freelance work, making tools for other workers gambling, offering specialized services like letter writing for illiterate colleagues, or trading goods between the construction site and local communities. Others use the time for purely social activities, visiting taverns, attending local festivals, or just sleeping as much as possible before another week of construction work begins. The market day also brings news from the outside world, political developments in Rome, military campaigns in distant provinces, births and deaths in workers' families, and gossip from other construction projects. It's the main connection between the insular world of the construction site and the larger Roman world that the workers are ultimately serving. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Aqua Appia workforce is how they developed a sense of pride in their work. Despite the difficult conditions, modest pay, and general lack of recognition for their contributions. These workers knew they were building something unprecedented, something that would serve the city of Rome for centuries to come. They took pride in their craftsmanship, their problem-solving abilities, and their contribution to Roman greatness. The evidence for this pride is everywhere in the archaeological record stones that are cut more precisely than necessary concrete work, that shows attention to aesthetic details that nobody would ever see, and inscriptions that express satisfaction with work well done. "We built this section in record time and it came out perfect," reads one inscription. The engineer said it was the best stonework he'd seen on the whole project. These weren't just workers building an aqueduct. They were craftsmen creating a monument to human ingenuity and determination. They understood that their names wouldn't be remembered by history, but their work would outlast the politicians who took credit for it and the engineers who designed it. In its own way, that was enough. After nearly 8 years of construction cost overruns that had bankrupted entire provinces' engineering crises, that had nearly caused nervous breakdowns among the project management team, and workplace accidents that had created their own dedicated sections in Roman medical textbooks, the moment had finally arrived. The Aqua Appia was complete, and it was time for what might be the most consequential product launch in human history. Picture the scene. It's 304 BCE, and you're standing in the Roman Forum on what will later be remembered as the day that changed everything. The entire city has turned out for the grand opening ceremony, from senators in their finest togas to slaves, who have been given the day off just to witness this historic moment. The air is thick with anticipation incense from various sacrificial altars and the general aromatic complexity of 50,000 people gathered in close quarters during a Roman summer. At the center of it all stands Appius Claudius Caecus, the man whose crazy idea had started this whole magnificent disaster. He's older now, grayer, and probably suffering from what we would recognize as chronic, stress-related health problems. But he's also about to achieve something that will make his name immortal. He's about to turn on the taps on the world's first long-distance water delivery system. The ceremony begins as all Roman ceremonies do, with elaborate religious rituals designed to ensure that the gods approve of human engineering projects. Priests perform sacrifices to Aqua, the goddess of water, offering prayers that the new aqueduct will flow reliably for centuries to come. They make offerings to Neptune, asking for his blessing on this attempt to redirect his domain for human purposes. They even sacrifice to Terminus, the god of boundaries, apologizing for moving so much earth and stone around without asking permission first. The religious ceremonies serve a practical purpose beyond divine approval. They give the engineers time for last-minute checks of the system, final adjustments to valves and distribution mechanisms, and general panic about whether this whole thing is actually going to work. Because despite 8 years of construction and countless tests of individual components, nobody really knows what will happen when they open the main flow valve and commit the entire system to its first full-scale operation. Marcus, chief engineer, the man who replaced Gaius Plautius after the gradient crisis, has spent the last week obsessively checking every valve, every connection, every measurement point along the 11-mile length of the aqueduct. He's calculated and recalculated the flow rates, the pressure differentials, and the settling times. He's tested the hydraulic compensation system, inspected the distribution chambers, and verified that the settling tanks are properly sealed and calibrated. But all of his calculations and tests are about to be rendered irrelevant by the ultimate test: does water actually flow from the source to the city when you open all the valves and hope for the best? The opening ceremony itself is a masterpiece of Roman political theater. Appius gives a speech that manages to take credit for the vision, thank the gods for their assistance, praise the workers for their dedication, and promise the citizens of Rome that their lives are about to be transformed by the miracle of clean, reliable water delivery. It's the kind of speech that politicians have been giving at infrastructure ceremonies for 2,000 years, combining genuine pride with shameless self-promotion and careful avoidance of any mention of cost overruns or construction delays. The crowd responds with the kind of enthusiasm that Romans reserve for gladiatorial games and military triumphs. They cheer Appius, they cheer the engineers, they cheer the workers, and they cheer the general concept of not having to carry water buckets up 6 flights of stairs every day. The atmosphere is festive, optimistic, and completely oblivious to the possibility that the whole system might fail spectacularly in front of 50,000 witnesses. Then comes the moment that 8 years of work have been building toward Appius approaches the main valve that controls the flow of water from the Aqua Appia into the Roman distribution system. It's a bronze mechanism the size of a small door operated by a wheel that requires considerable strength to turn. The valve represents the culmination of Roman hydraulic engineering, the interface between the natural water sources in the distant hills and the artificial distribution system that will serve the needs of 1 million people. Appius places his hands on the valve. Will looks out at the crowd with the expression of a man who knows that his place in history depends on what happens in the next few minutes, and begins to turn. The valve opens slowly because Roman engineering tends to favor reliability over speed, and because the pressure in the system requires careful management to prevent catastrophic failures. For the first few seconds, nothing visible happens. The crowd waits in silence, straining to hear the sound of flowing water, watching for any sign that the system is working. Then, somewhere in the distance, someone shouts, "Water in the first fountain." The shout is picked up and repeated as the news spreads through the crowd. Water in the distribution chamber, flow in the second fountain, pressure in the public baths. One by one, the fountains throughout Rome begin to flow. Clean, clear water from springs in the Alban Hills, carried 11 miles through channels, tunnels, and settling tanks, emerges from bronze spouts into stone basins. The public baths begin to fill with water that doesn't smell like the Tiber River. The distribution points throughout the city activate, providing access to water that residents can actually drink without worrying about dysentery, cholera, or whatever else might be floating in the local supply. The crowd erupts in celebration. People cheer, they cry, they embrace strangers, they offer spontaneous prayers of thanksgiving to whatever gods might be responsible for this miracle. It's the kind of pure, unguarded joy that occurs when people witness something they never thought they would see in their lifetimes. But the real celebration happens in the neighborhoods, away from the official ceremony, where ordinary Romans experience the practical impact of the new water system. For the first time in the history of the city, residents can fill containers with clean water without walking to distant fountains or paying premium prices to water carriers. Children can drink without their parents worrying about waterborne diseases. Women can do laundry with water that doesn't leave their clothes dirtier than when they started. The public baths experience their own transformation. Instead of rationing water and reusing it until it resembled soup, the bath operators can now provide fresh hot water throughout the day. The baths become social centers in a way they never were before, places where Romans can gather not just for hygiene, but for relaxation, conversation, and the simple pleasure of soaking in clean, warm water. The economic impact is immediate and dramatic. Water carriers who had been essential workers in the old system suddenly find their services much less in demand. Some adapt by focusing on delivery to upper floors of apartment buildings where residents still prefer the convenience of door-to-door service. Others find new occupations in the expanded economy that the reliable water supply makes possible. New businesses emerge almost overnight. Public laundries that can afford to use clean water. Food vendors who can prepare meals without worrying about water quality. Craftsmen who can use water-intensive techniques that were previously impractical. The reliable water supply doesn't just improve quality of life, it enables new forms of economic activity that weren't possible under the old system. The political impact is equally significant. Appius Claudius becomes a popular hero overnight, the man who solved Rome's water crisis and proved that Roman engineering can overcome any challenge. His political rivals, who had spent years criticizing the project as a waste of money, suddenly discover that opposing reliable water delivery is not a popular political position. The success of the Aqua Appia also establishes a new model for Roman public works projects. Future politicians will compete to sponsor aqueducts, roads, bridges, and other infrastructure projects, not just for the practical benefits, but for the political advantages that come with being associated with successful engineering achievements. But perhaps the most important impact is psychological. The successful completion of the Aqua Appia proves to Romans that they can accomplish things that nobody has ever attempted before. It establishes Roman engineering as something special, something that sets them apart from other civilizations. It creates a sense of confidence and ambition that will drive Roman expansion, an achievement for centuries to come. The opening ceremony concludes with more speeches, more sacrifices, and a public feast funded by grateful politicians who want to be associated with the success. But the real celebration continues for days as Romans throughout the city experience the simple pleasure of turning a tap and getting clean water. The engineering crews who built the aqueduct watch the celebration with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. They know better than anyone how many things could have gone wrong, how many crises were overcome, how many impossible problems were solved through trial and error and sheer bloody-minded determination. They also know that while Appius will be remembered as the visionary who made it all possible, history will forget the thousands of workers who turned the vision into reality. But that's okay. They have their own rewards, the satisfaction of work well done, the pride of building something that will outlast them by centuries, and the knowledge that they participated in one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history. The water flows, the fountains work, the people celebrate, and the Roman Empire takes another step toward becoming the greatest civilization the world has ever seen. It's a perfect ending to an imperfect project, a triumph that will be remembered long after the cost overruns and construction delays are forgotten. And somewhere in the distant hills at the source of the Aqua Appia, the springs continue to flow as they have for thousands of years, now captured and directed toward human purposes, but still obeying the same natural laws that have governed water since the beginning of time. The Romans have not conquered nature. They have learned to work with it, to redirect its power toward human needs, while respecting its fundamental principles. It's a lesson that will serve them well as they go on to build even more ambitious aqueducts, even more complex water systems, even more impressive demonstrations that human ingenuity can overcome almost any challenge when combined with sufficient determination, adequate funding, and willingness to learn from expensive mistakes. Fast forward about 400 years, the Aqua Appia has been flowing successfully for centuries. Rome now has 9 different aqueducts, bringing water from various sources, and the city's water system has become so complex that nobody really understands how it all works anymore. Enter Sextus Julius Frontinus, the man who would become the Oscar Martinez of Roman water management, obsessively detail-oriented, mathematically precise, and absolutely appalled by what he discovers when he starts looking at the books. It's 97 CE and Emperor Nerva has just appointed Frontinus as Curator Aquarum, essentially the chief water officer of the Roman Empire. It's a prestigious appointment, the kind of job that goes to respected senators who have proven their competence in military and administrative roles. Frontinus has served as governor of Britain, led successful military campaigns, and generally established himself as the sort of reliable, competent administrator that emperors like to put in charge of important things. What Frontinus doesn't know as he settles into his new office overlooking the Campus Martius is that he's about to uncover one of the greatest institutional scandals in Roman history. The water system that everyone assumes is running efficiently and honestly is actually a maze of corruption, incompetence, and creative accounting that would make a modern corporate auditor weep with recognition. Frontinus approaches his new job with the methodical precision of a man who has spent his career managing complex operations. His first step is to understand exactly what he's responsible for. 9 aqueducts, hundreds of miles of channels and pipes, thousands of distribution points, and a workforce that includes engineers, maintenance crews, inspectors, and administrators. It's like being put in charge of a small country except that this small country happens to be the infrastructure that keeps the greatest city in the world functioning. His second step is to review the existing documentation, and this is where things start to get interesting. The official records maintained by a bureaucracy that has grown increasingly elaborate over the centuries show a water system that operates with clockwork precision. Water flows are carefully measured, distribution is meticulously planned, maintenance is performed on schedule, and everything balances out perfectly in the ledgers. The problem is that Frontinus is the kind of person who doesn't just read reports. He goes out and checks whether the reports match reality, and when he starts comparing the official documentation with actual field conditions, he discovers discrepancies that range from minor accounting errors to massive systematic fraud. Let's follow Frontinus on one of his inspection tours, because watching a meticulous Roman administrator discover institutional corruption is like watching a really good accountant audit a really bad company. It's simultaneously fascinating and horrifying. Frontinus starts at the Aqua Marcia, one of the newer aqueducts that's supposed to be delivering the highest quality water to the most important districts of Rome. According to the official records, the Aqua Marcia is operating at 85% capacity, delivering exactly the amount of water specified in the original engineering plans with minimal waste and optimal distribution efficiency. Frontinus measures the actual flow at the source and discovers that the Aqua Marcia is actually operating at about 60% capacity. Somewhere between the source and the city, approximately 25% of the water is disappearing. This could be due to leaks, evaporation, or what Frontinus suspects is a more deliberate form of water loss. Following the aqueduct toward Rome, Frontinus and his team of inspectors discover the first unauthorized tap about 5 miles from the source. It's a sophisticated installation clearly built by people who understand hydraulic engineering that diverts water from the main channel into a private distribution system serving a large villa complex. The tap is completely invisible from the main inspection route, cleverly concealed behind what appears to be routine maintenance infrastructure. The villa turns out to belong to Senator Gaius' wealthy person, a man whose official water allocation, according to the records, should provide enough water for a modest fountain and basic household needs. The actual installation could supply a small town complete with elaborate gardens, multiple pools, and what appears to be a private bath complex that rivals some public facilities. This is Frontinus's introduction to the wonderful world of Roman water corruption, and it's just the beginning. Over the following months, his inspections reveal a systematic pattern of unauthorized taps, illegal diversions, and creative interpretation of water allocation permits that has turned the Roman water system into a kind of hydraulic free-for-all. The corruption operates on multiple levels with different schemes for different types of customers. Wealthy homeowners simply hire private contractors to install unauthorized taps, paying bribes to water system employees to look the other way. Commercial operations like public baths and laundries negotiate under-the-table deals for additional water allocations that don't appear in any official records. Even some government buildings have been getting more water than they're officially entitled to, through arrangements that seem to involve everyone except the people who are supposed to be overseeing the system. But the really creative corruption involves what Frontinus calls pipe fraud, a scheme so elaborate that it requires its own section in his final report. Here's how it works. The official regulations specify the size of pipes that different customers are allowed to use, with larger pipes requiring higher fees and special permits. But the regulations only specify the internal diameter of the pipes, not the external diameter or the shape of the inlet. Enterprising customers discovered that they could install pipes with the correct internal diameter, but with specially designed inlets that dramatically increase the actual water flow. Some used funnel-shaped inlets that gathered water from a wider area. Others used pipes that were technically the right diameter, but were flattened into oval shapes that increased the cross-sectional area. Enterprising customers discovered that they could install pipes with the correct internal diameter, but with specially designed inlets that dramatically increased the actual water flow. Some used funnel-shaped inlets that gathered water from a wider area. Others used pipes that were technically the right diameter, but were flattened into oval shapes that increased the cross-sectional area. Still others installed multiple pipes of the permitted size connected to a single distribution system, effectively multiplying their water allocation without violating the letter of the law. Frontinus documents these schemes with the obsessive detail of a man who genuinely enjoys catching people being cleverly dishonest. His report reads like a technical manual written by someone who finds engineering fraud personally offensive. The pipe belonging to Marcus Devius shows an internal diameter of exactly 1 Roman inch, as specified in his permit. However, the inlet has been modified with a bronze funnel that increases the effective gathering area by a factor of 3. The customer is thus receiving 3 times his authorized water allocation while technically complying with the dimensional requirements of his permit. The pipe fraud schemes reveal something important about Roman engineering culture. These people were really good at solving technical problems even when the problems involved circumventing their own regulations. The level of hydraulic engineering skill required to design some of these unauthorized modifications was impressive by any standard. These weren't crude hacks. They were sophisticated engineering solutions that demonstrated a deep understanding of fluid dynamics and system design. But Frontinus's investigations revealed that the corruption goes far beyond creative pipe engineering. The maintenance system itself has been compromised by what modern business consultants would recognize as a classic kickback scheme. Maintenance crews are supposed to perform regular inspections and repairs according to a fixed schedule, funded by budget allocations from the imperial treasury. In practice, the crews have been supplementing their income by providing expedited maintenance services to customers who are willing to pay extra fees. Here's how the maintenance kickback scheme works. When a customer reports a problem with their water supply, the official response time is supposed to be within 10 days. But customers who pay additional fees to the maintenance supervisor can get same-day service. The extra fees don't go into the imperial treasury, they go directly into the pockets of the maintenance crew. This creates a perverse incentive system where maintenance crews have financial reasons to provide slow, inadequate service to customers who only pay the official fees while providing excellent service to customers who pay bribes. The result is a 2-tier maintenance system that violates every principle of public administration that Rome has supposedly established. Frontinus also discovers that the water allocation system itself has been corrupted by what he calls permit multiplication. Here's how this works. Wealthy customers apply for multiple water permits under different names using slaves, freedmen, family members, and business partners as nominal permit holders. Each permit individually appears to be for a reasonable amount of water, but when combined, they provide enough water to supply a small palace. The permit office, which is supposed to track total water allocations to prevent oversubscription of the system, has been either unable or unwilling to detect these schemes. Whether this is due to incompetence or corruption is unclear, but the practical result is that some customers are receiving 10 or 20 times their legitimate water allocation, while other districts of the city are experiencing shortages. The most outrageous case that Frontinus documents involves a single wealthy family that has obtained 17 different water permits, nominally for 17 different properties, but all connected to a single distribution system serving one enormous villa complex. The family is legally entitled to enough water for basic household needs. They're actually receiving enough water to supply a medium-sized town, and they're paying fees based on their official allocation rather than their actual usage. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery in Frontinus's audit is the revelation that some water system employees have been operating what amounts to a protection racket. Customers who refuse to pay unofficial fees find themselves experiencing mysterious technical problems, pipes that develop leaks, valves that malfunction, distribution problems that somehow never get resolved. Customers who pay the fees enjoy reliable service and prompt attention to any issues. This protection racket extends to the inspection system itself. The water system is supposed to be regularly inspected by imperial officials who verify that customers are complying with their permit requirements and that the system is operating efficiently. In practice, many of these inspections have become formalities where inspectors are paid to overlook violations and submit favorable reports regardless of actual conditions. Frontinus's methodical documentation of these problems reads like a case study in institutional corruption. Every level of the water system bureaucracy has been compromised: the permit office that issues authorizations, the maintenance crews that keep the system running, the inspection teams that monitor compliance, and the accounting office that tracks usage and fees. It's a comprehensive failure of government oversight that has turned a public utility into a private profit center for corrupt employees. The scope of the corruption is staggering. Frontinus estimates that the Roman water system is losing approximately 40% of its capacity to unauthorized diversions, inefficient distribution, and outright theft. That's millions of gallons per day that are supposed to be serving the public, but are instead being diverted to private customers who have learned to game the system. The financial impact is equally severe. The imperial treasury is losing enormous amounts of revenue from unpaid fees, unauthorized usage, and maintenance contracts that aren't being properly fulfilled. At the same time, the costs of operating the system have increased because the corruption has created inefficiencies that require additional resources to manage. But perhaps the most serious consequence is the impact on public health and safety. The unauthorized taps and illegal diversions have reduced water pressure throughout the system, affecting the reliability of service to legitimate customers. Some districts of Rome are experiencing water shortages not because the aqueducts lack capacity, but because so much water is being diverted to unauthorized users. Frontinus responds to these discoveries with the systematic thoroughness that made him a successful military commander. He doesn't just document the problems, he develops comprehensive solutions that address both the immediate symptoms and the underlying causes of the corruption. His reforms begin with what we might call hydraulic forensics, a complete technical audit of every major installation in the water system. Frontinus's teams measure pipe sizes, test flow rates, inspect connections, and verify that actual installations match the specifications in official permits. Any discrepancies are documented, photographed, and added to a master database that tracks violations across the entire system. The pipe fraud schemes are addressed through new technical standards that specify not just internal pipe diameter, but external diameter inlet configuration and connection methods. The new regulations are written by people who understand exactly how the old regulations were being circumvented, and they close the loopholes that made creative interpretation possible. The maintenance kickback schemes are eliminated through administrative reforms that include random inspections, standardized response times, and financial audits of maintenance crew activities. Frontinus also establishes what amounts to an internal affairs unit for the water department, with investigators who specialize in detecting employee corruption. The permit multiplication schemes are addressed through a comprehensive database that tracks all water allocations by property address rather than permit holder name. The new system makes it impossible for customers to obtain multiple permits for the same location, and it provides water administrators with real-time information about total allocations versus system capacity. But Frontinus's most important reform is cultural. He establishes a new professional ethic for water system employees that emphasizes public service over private profit. He raises salaries to reduce the financial incentive for corruption, establishes clear performance standards, and creates advancement opportunities for employees who demonstrate integrity and competence. The results of Frontinus's reforms are dramatic and immediate. Water system efficiency improves by nearly 50% within the first year. Revenue increases substantially as unauthorized users are forced to pay proper fees. Service reliability improves throughout the city as water that was being diverted to private customers is returned to the public distribution system. But perhaps the most important result is the restoration of public confidence in Roman government administration. Frontinus proves that institutional corruption can be identified, documented, and eliminated through systematic reform and competent management. His success establishes a model for government accountability that will influence Roman administration for centuries. Frontinus documents his entire investigation and reform process in a treatise called Deacus on the aqueducts, which becomes the standard reference work for water system management throughout the Roman Empire. But more than a technical manual, Deacus is a case study in how to identify and eliminate institutional corruption while maintaining the functionality of complex systems. Reading Frontinus today is like reading the report of a really good auditor who discovered that everyone was stealing from the company, figured out exactly how they were doing it, and implemented systems to prevent it from happening again. He's the Oscar Martinez of the ancient world, methodical, precise, and absolutely committed to making sure that the numbers add up and the systems work the way they're supposed to work. And so what happened next? What's the long-term impact of spending decades and fortunes building artificial rivers to carry water across impossible distances? Well, it turns out that reliable water delivery is one of those quiet technologies that changes absolutely everything, usually in ways that nobody anticipated when the project was first proposed. Let's play the what-if game for a moment. What if Appius Claudius had been a more sensible person? What if that crucial meeting in 312 BCE had ended with someone saying, "You know what, this aqueduct idea is completely insane. Let's just pray for more rain and maybe dig some deeper wells." What would have happened to Rome, to the Roman Empire, and to the course of human history? Without the aqueducts, Rome would have remained what it was in the 4th century BCE, a large, important, but ultimately limited city, constrained by the carrying capacity of its local environment. The population would have stabilized at maybe 200,000 people, which is about the maximum that could be supported by local water sources, even with the most efficient management. A Rome of 200,000 people would still have been significant, but it wouldn't have been the Rome we know from history. It wouldn't have been able to support the massive bureaucracy required to administer a Mediterranean-spanning empire. It wouldn't have been able to maintain the enormous standing armies needed to conquer and hold distant territories. It wouldn't have become the cultural and economic magnet that drew the best minds, the most ambitious entrepreneurs, and the most skilled craftsmen from across the known world. More fundamentally, without the aqueducts, Rome would never have developed the engineering confidence that enabled later achievements. The successful completion of the Aqua Appia proved to Romans that they could accomplish things that nobody had ever attempted before. It established Roman engineering as something special, something that set them apart from other civilizations. That confidence, that sense of being able to overcome any technical challenge through determination and systematic problem solving became a defining characteristic of Roman culture. Think about the other great Roman engineering achievements: the road system that connected Britain to Mesopotamia, the harbor works that enabled Mediterranean trade, the massive building projects that created the architectural wonders we still admire today. All of these projects required the same kind of ambitious thinking, systematic planning, and willingness to solve unprecedented technical challenges that characterized the aqueduct construction. Without the confidence gained from building the aqueducts, would the Romans have attempted to build the Pantheon with its impossible concrete dome that still inspires awe? Today, would they have tackled the engineering challenges of constructing the Colosseum, a building so complex that modern architects study it to understand advanced crowd management and structural engineering? Would they have built Trajan's Column, Hadrian's Wall, or any of the other monuments that demonstrate Roman engineering at its most ambitious? The aqueducts also had profound social and economic effects that rippled through Roman society in ways that nobody could have predicted. Reliable water delivery enabled the development of the Roman bath culture, which became far more than just a hygiene system. The baths became social centers, business meeting places, cultural institutions, and symbols of Roman civilization that spread throughout the empire. The Roman approach to public baths was revolutionary. These weren't facilities for the wealthy elite, but public institutions that served all social classes. Citizens and slaves, rich and poor, Romans and foreigners could all use the same facilities, creating a kind of social mixing that was unusual in the ancient world. The baths became spaces where social barriers were temporarily suspended, where people from different backgrounds could interact as equals, and where Roman culture was transmitted to newcomers from across the empire. This bath culture, enabled by abundant water, became one of the most effective tools of Romanization. When Roman engineers built aqueducts in newly conquered territories, they weren't just providing water. They were introducing a way of life that gradually transformed local cultures. Provincial cities that received aqueducts developed their own bath complexes, adopted Roman hygiene practices, and began to think of themselves as participants in Roman civilization rather than subjects of Roman conquest. The economic effects were equally transformative. Reliable water delivery enabled industries that would have been impossible under the old system. Large-scale food processing, textile production, metalworking, and countless other economic activities became feasible when entrepreneurs didn't have to worry about water availability or quality. The Roman economy became increasingly specialized and interconnected, with different regions focusing on the industries that best suited their resources and expertise. This specialization was only possible because cities could grow large enough to support specialized craftsmen, merchants, and service providers. And cities could only grow large when they had reliable water supplies that supported large populations. The aqueducts also enabled what might be the most important Roman innovation, the development of professional urban administration. Managing a city of 1 million people requires sophisticated systems for public health, law enforcement, emergency services, and infrastructure maintenance. These systems could only develop in cities large enough to require them and wealthy enough to fund them. The administrative techniques that Romans developed to manage large urban populations became templates that were applied throughout the empire. Provincial cities adopted Roman methods for public administration, legal systems, tax collection, and infrastructure management. The aqueducts made large cities possible, large cities made professional administration necessary, and professional administration made imperial governance possible. But perhaps the most profound long-term impact of the aqueducts was their effect on Roman attitudes toward nature and technology. Before the aqueducts, humans were generally at the mercy of natural water sources. You built your city where there was water, you limited your population to what the local environment could support, and you accepted that water scarcity was a fact of life that couldn't be changed. The aqueducts proved that humans could move water, redirect it, control it, and use it to overcome natural limitations. This was a revolutionary concept that fundamentally changed the relationship between human civilization and the natural environment. Instead of accepting natural constraints, Romans began to see them as engineering challenges that could be solved through human ingenuity and determination. This new attitude toward nature and technology spread throughout Roman culture and eventually throughout the territories that Rome conquered. It became a defining characteristic of Western civilization, the belief that natural obstacles can be overcome through engineering, that human needs justify large-scale modification of the environment, and that technology can solve problems that previous generations accepted as unsolvable. Of course, this technological optimism also had its dark side. The Roman willingness to reshape the environment for human purposes led to deforestation, mining that devastated landscapes, and agricultural practices that exhausted soil fertility. The same engineering confidence that built the aqueducts also built military machines that conquered and enslaved entire populations. But the positive legacy is undeniable. The Roman aqueducts established principles of public works, planning, engineering, project management, and infrastructure maintenance. That remained the standard for over 1,000 years. When European engineers began building large-scale water systems again during the Renaissance, they studied Roman techniques and Roman examples. The collapse of the Roman aqueduct system during the decline of the Western Empire provides its own lessons about the relationship between technology and civilization. The aqueducts didn't fail because of engineering problems. They failed because the social and political systems that maintained them collapsed. Barbarian invasions disrupted the supply chains that provided materials for maintenance. Economic decline made it impossible to fund the skilled workers needed to keep the systems operating. Political fragmentation meant that nobody had the authority or resources to coordinate maintenance across multiple territories. The great aqueducts gradually fell silent, not because they were poorly built, but because maintaining complex technological systems requires stable, prosperous societies with effective governments. The engineering was sound. It was the civilization that failed. The ruins of Roman aqueducts scattered across Europe and North Africa stand as monuments to both human achievement and human fragility. The Pont du Gard still carries tourists across the same valley where it once carried water. The arches of the Aqua Claudia still march across the Roman countryside, testament to the ambition and skill of their builders. But they're also reminders that even the greatest technological achievements depend on the societies that create and maintain them. Modern water systems face many of the same challenges that confronted Frontinus: aging infrastructure, budget constraints, political conflicts over resource allocation, and the constant need to balance public service with financial sustainability. The specific technologies have changed, but the fundamental problems of delivering clean water to large populations remain remarkably similar to those faced by Roman engineers 2,000 years ago. The Roman aqueducts proved that humans can build systems that outlast the civilizations that create them. Some Roman aqueducts continued to function for centuries after the fall of Rome, maintained by medieval communities that had lost the knowledge to build new ones, but retained enough skill to keep the old ones working. The engineering knowledge eventually disappeared, but the infrastructure remained serving human needs long after its builders were forgotten. In the end, that might be the most important legacy of the Roman aqueducts. They demonstrated that human beings can create things that are larger and more durable than themselves. The politicians who authorized the projects, the engineers who designed them, and the workers who built them all died long ago. But the water still flows, the principles still apply, and the example still inspires. Every time a modern engineer designs a water treatment plant, every time a city planner maps out a distribution system, every time a project manager coordinates a complex infrastructure project, they're following in the footsteps of people who stood in that tent at mile marker 6 and decided that the solution to impossible problems is not to give up, but to try something that's never been done before. That's the real legacy of the Roman aqueducts, not just the water they delivered, but the proof they provided that human ingenuity, determination, and systematic problem solving can overcome obstacles that seem insurmountable. It's a lesson that remains as relevant today as it was in 312 BCE when Appius Claudius first proposed building a river. So, what's the real takeaway here? Pretty wild, right? We've spent the last 2.5 hours diving deep into what might be the most beautifully chaotic project management disaster in human history. And honestly, it's kind of amazing that any of it worked at all. Think about what we've witnessed. For every foot of elegant archway you see in those postcard photos, there were probably miles of paperwork, dozens of meetings where nobody agreed on anything, countless arguments about the quality of cement, and at least one complete crisis that nearly brought the whole project crashing down. The glory of Rome wasn't just built on the backs of its legions, but on the tired shoulders of its surveyors, who measured the same gradient 17 times. Just to be sure, its masons who cut stones with obsessive precision, and its long-suffering project managers who somehow kept thousands of workers coordinated across 11 miles of construction chaos. The Romans succeeded not because they never made mistakes, but because they were absolutely stubbornly, magnificently committed to making their mistakes work. When their calculations were wrong, they didn't give up. They invented new ways to calculate. When their engineering techniques proved inadequate, they developed better techniques. When their original plans turned out to be completely unrealistic, they modified the plans, changed the specifications, and kept building until they achieved something that was actually better than what they had originally envisioned. It's simultaneously inspiring and exhausting to think about. These people built a stone river across 11 miles of Italian countryside, using tools that would be considered primitive by medieval standards, coordinated through a management system that relied entirely on human messengers and handwritten notes, funded through a budget process that would make modern accountants weep, and somehow produced a system that worked reliably for over 400 years. It kind of makes you appreciate your boring office job, doesn't it? At least when your boss has a terrible idea, it usually just results in a bad PowerPoint presentation or maybe an awkward team building exercise. It doesn't result in thousands of people spending years digging tunnels through mountains while trying not to die from falling rocks. And the next time you get a glass of water from the tap without a second thought, maybe spare a moment for the ancient engineers who wrestled with mountains, bureaucrats, and basic physics to make it possible. Every time you turn on a faucet, you're benefiting from innovations that were developed by people who had no idea what they were doing, but were too stubborn to admit it. The parallels with modern project management are both hilarious and sobering. We still deal with impossible deadlines, unrealistic budgets, and clients who change their requirements halfway through the project. We still have incompetent bosses' office politics that interfere with getting work done, and that one coworker who somehow manages to take credit for everyone else's achievements. We still encounter unexpected technical challenges, supply chain problems, and regulatory requirements that nobody anticipated when the project was first planned. The Romans just did it all on a much grander scale, with higher stakes and with significantly more opportunities for spectacular failure. When a Roman engineering project went wrong, people didn't just lose money. They lost their lives, their reputations, and sometimes their entire civilizations. But they also achieved things that we can barely imagine attempting today. When was the last time anyone proposed building something that would last for 4 centuries? When did you last encounter a public works project that was designed not just to meet immediate needs, but to serve as a foundation for future expansion and development that the original planners couldn't even envision? It's a reminder that human nature doesn't really change. We still deal with the same fundamental challenges that confronted Roman project managers coordinating complex activities across multiple locations. Managing diverse workforces with different skills and motivations, balancing competing demands for limited resources, and somehow delivering results that meet everyone's expectations while staying within budget and on schedule. The difference is scale and ambition. The Romans were willing to attempt things that seemed impossible, commit resources that seemed excessive, and persist through setbacks that would have ended most modern projects. They had a fundamental confidence in human ingenuity that enabled them to tackle challenges that more cautious civilizations would have avoided entirely. So, what do you guys think? What was the most mind-blowing or ridiculously office-like detail for you? Was it the discovery that Roman contractors were already gaming the system with creative pipe modifications that technically complied with regulations while completely violating their spirit? The realization that construction site graffiti has been basically the same for 2,000 years. The fact that even ancient engineers had to deal with scope creep, budget overruns, and clients who couldn't make up their minds about what they actually wanted. Or maybe it was the sheer audacity of the whole enterprise, the willingness to commit to building something that had never been attempted, before using techniques that hadn't been invented yet, with a budget that was completely hypothetical, and a timeline that existed more in hope than in reality. Let me know in the comments below what resonated with you, what surprised you, or what made you think differently about ancient history or modern project management. I read all of them, especially when I'm procrastinating on researching the next historical deep dive, which is basically always. Alright everyone, that's it from me for tonight. Thanks for hanging out and nerding out about Roman plumbing with me for the last 2.5 hours. I hope this was just the right amount of boring to help you relax, unwind, and maybe even drift off to sleep with visions of perfectly calculated gradients and obsessively precise stone-cutting dancing in your head. If you made it all the way to the end, you're either genuinely interested in ancient infrastructure projects, or you have remarkable stamina for historical minutiae. Either way, I appreciate your company on this long, meandering journey through the bureaucratic chaos that somehow produced one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history. Sleep well tonight. Dream of surveyors' chains and water levels of stonemasons who took pride in their work, and of engineers who solved impossible problems through sheer bloody-minded determination. Dream of a time when people were willing to spend decades building things that would benefit strangers they would never meet in service of a vision that extended far beyond their own lifetimes. and I'll catch you in the next deep dive into historical chaos. Got any ideas for what ancient dumpster fire we should investigate next? The construction of the pyramids, perhaps, where thousands of workers somehow managed to coordinate the placement of millions of stone blocks without any of the project management tools we consider essential today. The building of the Great Wall of China, which makes Roman aqueduct construction look like a weekend DIY project. The development of medieval cathedrals, where construction projects routinely took longer than human lifespans and required coordination across generations of craftsmen. Drop your suggestions below. I'm always looking for new ways to make ancient history feel simultaneously epic and completely relatable. And there's no shortage of historical projects that combined incredible ambition with spectacular organizational chaos. Until next time, remember that every great achievement in human history started with someone saying the words that terrify project managers everywhere. How hard can it be? The Romans proved that the answer is usually much harder than anyone expects, but not too hard to accomplish if you're willing to be patient. Flexible and slightly obsessive about getting the details right. Good night, everyone. May your water pressure always be adequate and your engineering projects only slightly over budget.